I never thought a simple dinner invitation would end with my father throwing my belongings onto the marble steps of our family's estate, while my mother stood behind him declaring that I was no longer their daughter. Even less could I have imagined that the man they dismissed as a worthless construction worker would reveal himself to be worth more than our entire family fortune combined, transforming their horror into desperate attempts at reconciliation that would expose just how shallow their values truly were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But that moment of betrayal became the catalyst that not only freed me from their suffocating expectations, but also showed me what real love looked like when someone chooses you for who you are, not what you represent in their carefully constructed social hierarchy. My name is Catherine Elisabeth Thornfield, and for 24 years, I had lived my life according to a script written by my parents before I was even born. Every decision, from the private schools I attended to the social circles I moved in, had been carefully orchestrated to maintain what my mother called the Thornfield legacy of distinction. Our family had built their reputation on 3 generations of successful investment banking, and in their world, maintaining social standing wasn't just important, it was everything. The Thornfield estate sat on 40 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the exclusive Willowbrook Hills community, where property values started at 8 figures, and neighbors included tech moguls, entertainment executives, and old money families whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. Our Georgian colonial mansion, with its imported Italian marble and hand-carved mahogany details, had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, and my mother, Margaret, never tired of mentioning this fact during her elaborate dinner parties. My father, Charles Thornfield, had inherited Thornfield and Associates from his father, and had expanded it into one of the most prestigious boutique investment firms on the East Coast. He worked 16-hour days and measured success exclusively in terms of net worth and social connections. My mother had dedicated herself to being the perfect banker's wife, organizing charity galas, serving on museum boards, and ensuring that every aspect of our family's public image reflected what she deemed appropriate sophistication. From childhood, I had been groomed to marry within their approved circle, someone who would enhance rather than diminish the Thornfield reputation. They had introduced me to countless eligible bachelors, the sons of business partners, family, friends' children who had attended the right schools, young men whose trust funds and pedigrees met their exacting standards. None of these relationships had progressed beyond polite conversation and carefully chaperoned social events, partly because I found most of these men insufferably entitled, but mostly because I had never felt any genuine connection with someone whose primary qualification was their family's financial portfolio. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning in September when I stopped at Murphy's Corner Cafe, a small family-owned coffee shop near the downtown office where I worked as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit literacy foundation. I had discovered this place 6 months earlier when my usual Starbucks was closed for renovations, and I had been returning regularly ever since, drawn by their exceptional coffee and the warm, unpretentious atmosphere that felt refreshingly different from the sterile perfection of my usual environment. The cafe occupied the ground floor of a converted brick building from the 1920s with exposed wooden beams, mismatched vintage furniture, and local artwork covering the walls. The Murphy family had owned it for 15 years, and their genuine hospitality created the kind of community gathering place that was rapidly disappearing in our increasingly corporate landscape. I had become a regular customer, arriving each morning around 7:30 for my medium dark roast with a splash of cream, and the staff knew my order by heart. That particular morning, I was running late after a conference call with potential donors had extended longer than expected. I rushed through the cafe door, immediately colliding with someone carrying a large coffee and managing to spill the contents across both of us and the floor. The impact sent my laptop bag flying, scattering papers and sending my phone skittering across the vintage tile floor. I looked up to apologize, and found myself staring into the most striking pair of green eyes I had ever seen. The man I had crashed into stood about 6 feet tall, with dark brown hair and a genuinely amused expression, despite being covered in coffee. He wore work boots, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt over a plain white t-shirt that was now decorated, with a large brown stain. His hands, I noticed as he helped gather my scattered papers, were strong and calloused, clearly belonging to someone who worked with them regularly. "I am so sorry," I said, feeling heat rise to my cheeks as I realized how flustered I sounded. "I was rushing and not paying attention, and now you're covered in coffee and it's completely my fault." He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face, revealing laugh lines around his eyes and a warmth that seemed completely genuine. "Don't worry about it," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "Coffee stains wash out, and I was probably drinking too much caffeine anyway." As we knelt together collecting my papers, I became acutely aware of how different he seemed from the men in my usual social circle. There was no pretension in his manner, no calculated charm or obvious attempt to impress. He helped without expecting recognition or gratitude, handed me my phone after checking that the screen wasn't cracked, and seemed genuinely concerned that I might be hurt rather than annoyed about his ruined shirt. Mrs. Murphy appeared with towels and insisted on giving both of us fresh coffee on the house, scolding me gently for rushing around like the world was ending. As she cleaned up the spill, she introduced us properly. "Catherine, this is James Rivera, one of our best customers and the nicest young man you'll ever meet. James, this is Catherine, who's been brightening our mornings for months now with her smile and her generous tips. James Rivera." The name suited him somehow, strong and unpretentious. As we sat at a small corner table while Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Murphy fussed over getting us properly caffeinated. I found myself genuinely curious about this man who seemed so comfortable in his own skin. He worked in construction, he explained when I asked, specializing in restoration projects for historic buildings. His company was currently renovating the old Carnegie Library downtown, a project he described with obvious passion for preserving the building's original architectural details while updating it for modern use. The conversation flowed with surprising ease. James had grown up in the city, but had spent summers with his grandmother in Mexico, which explained the slight accent I had detected. He had studied architecture before shifting to construction, drawn by the hands-on satisfaction of actually building and restoring, rather than just designing. He asked thoughtful questions about my work with the Literacy Foundation, genuinely interested in our programs for adult learners and immigrant families. Unlike the polite inquiries I was accustomed to receiving about my job, his questions demonstrated real curiosity about the impact we were making, rather than just social obligation to show interest. When I finally checked my phone, I realized we had been talking for over an hour. I was already late for a staff meeting, but I found myself reluctant to leave this unexpected oasis of genuine conversation. James stood when I did, gathering his work jacket and hard hat from the chair beside him. "I hope your shirt isn't permanently stained," I said, still feeling guilty about the collision. He grinned, that warm expression that had caught my attention. "From the beginning, I've got about 20 shirts exactly like this one, so no worries at all. Besides, now I've got a good story to tell about meeting someone interesting." As I walked to my car, I found myself thinking about that last comment. Meeting someone interesting. When was the last time anyone had described me that way? In my parents' social circle, I was always introduced in terms of my family connections and accomplishments, rather than as an individual worth knowing for my own qualities. The men I typically encountered seemed more interested in the Thornfield name and what association with our family might offer them professionally than in discovering who I actually was as a person. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to Murphy's Corner Cafe each morning, hoping to encounter James again. On Thursday, he was there, sitting at the same corner table with architectural drawings spread across the surface, and he looked up with obvious pleasure when I approached. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. He immediately cleared space for my coffee and breakfast, explaining that he often stopped by the cafe before heading to job sites because their Wi-Fi was more reliable than what was available at the construction trailer. This became our routine over the following weeks. We would meet at Murphy's most mornings, sharing coffee and conversation before heading to our respective workplaces. I learned that James had started his construction company 5 years earlier, after working for several larger firms where he had become frustrated by their focus on profit margins over quality craftsmanship. His small team specialized in historic preservation, and he took obvious pride in their reputation for meticulous attention to detail and respect for original architectural integrity. He told me about projects they had completed, from restoring a 19th-century church damaged by flooding to converting an abandoned warehouse into affordable housing while maintaining its industrial character. His enthusiasm for his work was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to his stories about unexpected discoveries during renovations. Hidden murals behind layers of paint, original hardwood floors beneath decades of carpeting, architectural details that revealed the building's history and the craftsmanship of previous generations. In return, I shared more about my work at the Literacy Foundation than I had ever discussed with anyone in my family's social circle. James listened intently as I described our programs, asked insightful questions about the challenges adult learners faced, and offered practical suggestions based on his experience working with immigrant crew members who were developing their English skills while learning construction trades. His perspective was refreshing, grounded in real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge or charitable condescension. As September turned into October, our morning conversations gradually extended into occasional lunch meetings and weekend coffee dates. James introduced me to parts of the city I had never properly explored. Small family restaurants in immigrant neighborhoods where the food was exceptional and the prices were a fraction of what I was accustomed to paying at the upscale establishments my family frequented. We visited art galleries in converted warehouses, attended outdoor concerts in neighborhood parks, and explored farmers markets where he knew vendors by name and could recommend the best seasonal produce. These experiences opened my eyes to how limited my previous social circle had been. The Thornfield family moved exclusively in environments designed for people with significant disposable income, carefully curated spaces where economic barriers ensured a certain homogeneity of background and perspective. James introduced me to communities defined by shared interests and values rather than financial status, places where creativity and authenticity mattered more than pedigree and wealth. I began to understand how insulated my upbringing had been. Despite my parents' emphasis on cultural sophistication and international awareness, their actual exposure to diversity was remarkably limited. Their charitable work, while generous, in financial terms, involved writing checks rather than direct engagement with the communities they claimed to support. Their cultural activities centered on institutions that catered to major donors rather than grassroots artistic expression. Even their travel, which they considered broadening, typically involved luxury accommodations and guided experiences designed to minimize contact with local realities that might prove uncomfortable or challenging. With James, I discovered a different definition of cultural richness. His grandmother had taught him to cook traditional Mexican dishes using recipes passed down through generations. He spoke Spanish fluently and served as an informal translator for crew members navigating bureaucratic procedures or medical appointments. His knowledge of architecture encompassed not just formal training, but also appreciation for vernacular building traditions and indigenous construction techniques. His curiosity about other cultures was based on genuine respect rather than exotic fascination, and his friendships crossed lines of ethnicity, education, and economic status in ways that would have been impossible within my family's social constraints. By November, I realized I was falling in love with James Rivera in a way I had never experienced before. This wasn't the careful evaluation of compatibility and social advantages that my parents had encouraged me to apply to potential relationships. Instead, it was a deep appreciation for his character, his values, and the way he made me feel like the best version of myself when we were together. He challenged me intellectually without being condescending, supported my ambitions while encouraging me to think beyond the limitations I had unconsciously accepted, and treated me as an equal partner in our developing relationship, rather than as a prize to be won or a social connection to be cultivated. The physical attraction was equally powerful, but in a completely different way than I had expected. James's calloused hands and work-hardened physique reflected genuine capability and dedication rather than the artificial results of expensive personal trainers and cosmetic procedures that characterized many men in my usual social circle. When he touched me, whether helping me navigate uneven sidewalks or simply taking my hand while we walked, I felt a connection that was both tender and electric, based on mutual desire rather than social expectation or strategic advantage. More importantly, James saw me clearly in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He noticed when I was genuinely excited about something versus when I was performing enthusiasm because it was expected. He called me out gently when I made assumptions based on privilege or repeated opinions I hadn't really examined. He encouraged me to trust my own judgment rather than deferring to external authority, and he celebrated qualities in me that my family had always treated as secondary to my appearance and social connections. With James, I discovered aspects of my personality that had been dormant or suppressed for years. I was more spontaneous, more willing to try new experiences, more comfortable expressing disagreement or uncertainty. I laughed more genuinely and worried less about whether my responses were appropriate according to some external standard. I felt intellectually stimulated by our conversations and emotionally nourished by his attention in ways that made me realize how superficial most of my previous relationships had been. The contrast became particularly stark during family dinners at the Thornfield estate. These elaborate affairs had always felt performative, with conversation topics carefully selected to showcase cultural knowledge and business acumen rather than genuine interest or curiosity. My parents' friends discussed their children's achievements in terms of prestigious universities attended, expensive graduate programs completed, and advantageous marriages contracted. Success was measured exclusively in financial terms and social positioning, with little attention paid to personal fulfillment, creative expression, or meaningful contribution to community welfare. Listening to these conversations after months of genuine connection with James felt increasingly hollow. The people my parents admired seemed to live remarkably narrow lives despite their extensive resources, traveling to the same exclusive destinations, attending the same charity events, and socializing within the same insular circles year after year. Their cultural interests were limited to institutions that provided social credibility rather than authentic artistic engagement, and their professional achievements seemed motivated more by status accumulation than by passion or purpose. I began to understand why I had always felt vaguely unsatisfied, despite having every material advantage. The Thornfield definition of success was based on external validation and comparative advantage rather than internal fulfillment or meaningful impact. My parents had provided me with excellent educational opportunities and financial security, but they had also unconsciously transmitted the message that my worth depended on meeting their expectations rather than discovering and developing my own values and capabilities. By December, James and I were spending most of our free time together, and I was struggling with how to manage the growing disconnect between this relationship that felt authentic and meaningful and my family's expectations. For my personal life, I had mentioned James casually during family dinners, describing him only as someone I had met at a coffee shop and enjoyed talking with, but I had avoided providing details about his background or the seriousness of our relationship. My mother's radar for romantic developments was finely tuned, however, and she had begun asking increasingly specific questions about my social activities and the amount of time I seemed to be spending away from family obligations. Margaret Thornfield had very definite ideas about appropriate courtship procedures, which involved formal introductions, carefully chaperoned group activities, and extensive background research into potential suitors' family histories and financial prospects. The fact that I was regularly seeing someone she hadn't met and approved of violated every protocol she had established for my romantic development. When she discovered through questioning that I had been declining invitations to events where she had planned to introduce me to eligible bachelors, her concern escalated into suspicion and eventually into direct confrontation. "Catherine, we need to discuss your recent behavior," she announced one Sunday afternoon as I prepared to leave for a planned visit to a historic house museum with James. "You've been declining social invitations that would benefit your development. And I understand you've been spending considerable time with someone we haven't met. This is unacceptable given your position in this family and the expectations that come with the Thornfield name." I realized that the careful balance I had been maintaining between my relationship with James and my family obligations was about to collapse. My parents weren't simply curious about my personal life. They were concerned about potential threats to their carefully constructed plans for my future. In their worldview, any serious relationship needed to enhance rather than detract from family status, and my secretiveness about James suggested that I understood he didn't meet their standards. The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental incompatibility between my parents' values and the relationship I had been developing with James. When I finally admitted that I was in love with someone who worked in construction and hadn't attended an elite university, my mother's reaction was immediate and devastating. The blood drained from her face as if I had announced a terminal illness, and she gripped the arm of her chair with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "Construction?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Catherine, please tell me you're not serious about someone who works with his hands for a living. What would people think? How could we possibly introduce him to our friends and business associates? This is exactly the kind of poor judgment that could destroy everything we've worked to build for this family." My father's response was more controlled, but equally disapproving. He explained patiently that while he respected honest work, romantic relationships carried implications beyond personal satisfaction. As a Thornfield, I had responsibilities to maintain the family's social and business connections, which required marrying someone who could contribute to rather than detract from those relationships. A construction worker, regardless of his personal qualities, simply couldn't provide the kind of partnership that would enhance the family's position in their social and professional circles. The argument that followed was unlike anything I had experienced with my parents previously. They had always been able to guide my decisions through a combination of logical persuasion and emotional manipulation, presenting their preferences as obvious common sense while making me feel guilty for even considering alternatives that might disappoint them. This time, however, I found myself defending James and our relationship with a passion that surprised all of us. I tried to explain what I had discovered about the limitations of their social circle and the richness of the communities James had introduced me to. I described his intelligence, his integrity, his dedication to meaningful work, and the way he treated me as an equal partner rather than as a social accessory. I argued that their definition of success was shallow and that their concerns about social approval revealed their own insecurity rather than genuine wisdom about relationship compatibility. My parents responded with increasing frustration as they realized that their usual methods of influence weren't working. My mother deployed guilt tactics, reminding me of the sacrifices they had made to provide me with advantages and the disappointment I was causing by rejecting their guidance. My father used logical arguments about practical considerations, pointing out that construction work was physically demanding and poorly compensated compared to the professional careers available to men in our social circle. When emotional manipulation and rational arguments failed to change my position, they escalated to direct ultimatums. If I continued seeing James, they would cut off my access to the trust fund that was scheduled to become available when I turned 25. They would remove me from consideration for any role in the family business and would stop including me in social events where my association with an inappropriate partner might embarrass them in front of their friends and business associates. These threats, which would have terrified me 6 months earlier, felt almost liberating now that they were finally explicit. I realized that my entire relationship with my parents had been based on implicit blackmail, the understanding that their love and support were conditional on my compliance with their expectations. They had never encouraged me to develop independent judgment or to pursue goals that didn't align with their vision for the family's social advancement. The argument culminated when I announced that I intended to invite James to our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, an elaborate formal affair that represented the pinnacle of Thornfield family social performance. This event typically included business associates, family friends, and carefully selected eligible bachelors who my parents hoped I might find interesting. The guest list was a who's who of the local social and business elite, and every detail, from the menu to the floral arrangements, was designed to showcase the family's sophistication and success. My declaration that I wanted to bring a construction worker to this sacred ritual was the final straw in my parents' tolerance for what they had been characterizing as a temporary phase of poor judgment. My father's face turned red with barely controlled anger as he informed me that such a plan was absolutely unacceptable and that I needed to choose immediately between James and my family. When I chose James, the explosion was swift and devastating. My mother burst into tears, claiming that I was destroying everything she had worked to build and that my selfishness would ruin the family's reputation permanently. My father declared that if I couldn't respect their standards and expectations, I was no longer welcome in their home until I came to my senses and ended this inappropriate relationship. Within an hour, I found myself standing on the circular driveway of the Thornfield estate with 3 suitcases containing my essential belongings, watching my father's Mercedes disappear back toward the house where I had lived for my entire life. My mother hadn't even said goodbye, remaining in her sitting room with a cold compress over her eyes while claiming that the stress was triggering one of her migraines. The shock of being literally thrown out of my family home was profound, but as I called James to explain what had happened, I realized that I felt more relieved than devastated. For the first time in my life, I was free to make decisions based on my own values rather than my parents' expectations. The price was higher than I had anticipated, but the liberation was worth more than I could have imagined. James arrived. Within 20 minutes, his work truck pulling into the driveway of the estate where he had never been welcome. He loaded my suitcases without asking unnecessary questions, held me while I cried tears that mixed grief with relief, and assured me that we would figure out everything else together. As we drove away from Willowbrook Hills toward his modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood across town, I felt like I was finally heading toward a life that belonged to me rather than to the Thornfield family legacy. The apartment James rented occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house with tall windows, original hardwood floors, and details that revealed his appreciation for architectural character. The space was small compared to what I was accustomed to, but it felt warm and authentic in ways that the Thornfield mansion never had. His furniture was simple but well-made. His books reflected genuine intellectual curiosity rather than decorative status, and his kitchen actually looked like someone who enjoyed cooking used it regularly. That first night, as we sat on his couch, sharing takeout Chinese food and planning how to handle the practical implications of my new independence, I realized that I had never felt more at home anywhere in my life. James didn't try to solve my problems or offer advice about reconciling with my parents. Instead, he listened carefully to my feelings about the day's events and asked thoughtful questions that helped me process the emotional complexity of choosing love over family approval. Over the following weeks, as I adjusted to life without the financial safety net and social infrastructure I had always taken for granted, I discovered capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. I found a larger apartment that we could afford together, negotiated with my employer for additional responsibilities that came with higher compensation, and learned to manage a budget that accounted for actual expenses rather than unlimited access to family resources. The practical challenges were significant but manageable. The emotional adjustment was more complex, as I grieved the loss of family relationships while simultaneously celebrating my newfound autonomy. My parents made no attempt to contact me, apparently convinced that financial pressure and social isolation would eventually force me to return to them apologetically and end my relationship with James. They had underestimated both my commitment to James and my satisfaction with the life we were building together. Without the constant pressure to maintain appearances according to Thornfield standards, I discovered interests and capabilities that had been dormant for years. I volunteered more extensively with the Literacy Foundation, taking on program development, responsibilities that utilized skills I hadn't realized I possessed. I learned to cook using James's grandmother's recipes, developing an appreciation for food traditions that connected families across generations rather than simply providing opportunities for social display. Most importantly, I experienced what it felt like to be loved for who I actually was, rather than what I represented in someone else's social calculations. James appreciated my intelligence without needing me to demonstrate it through cultural references designed to impress others. He valued my opinions without requiring them to align with predetermined positions, and he supported my ambitions while encouraging me to define success according to my own values rather than external expectations. As winter turned to spring, James and I began discussing marriage, not as a strategic alliance between families, but as a celebration of the partnership we had already built together. He proposed on a Saturday morning in Murphy's Corner Cafe, presenting me with a simple but elegant ring that he had designed himself and had crafted by a local jeweler who specialized in custom work. The setting incorporated architectural elements that reflected his profession and mine, a physical symbol of how our different backgrounds had come together to create something beautiful and unique. I said yes immediately, feeling more certain about this decision than I had ever felt about anything in my life. We decided to plan a small wedding ceremony that would reflect our values rather than social expectations, focusing on the people who genuinely cared about our happiness rather than attempting to impress a guest list designed for maximum social impact. The engagement announcement that appeared in the local newspaper was modest compared to the elaborate spreads that typically accompanied Thornfield family milestones, but it accurately represented our priorities and our relationship. When my parents read about our plans in the society section rather than hearing about them directly from me, their response was swift and predictable. My mother called my office at the Literacy Foundation, her voice tight with controlled emotion as she informed me that my behavior was embarrassing the family and that my decision to marry someone so completely inappropriate would have permanent consequences for my relationship with them. She had apparently hoped that my temporary infatuation would burn itself out once I experienced the practical challenges of living without family support, and my engagement represented a failure of her strategy that she found personally humiliating. My father's communication was more formal, delivered through the family attorney, who informed me that my trust fund would remain frozen indefinitely and that I should not expect any inheritance consideration as long as I remained married to someone who couldn't contribute appropriately to the Thornfield family legacy. The message was clear. They viewed my engagement as a betrayal that warranted permanent punishment, rather than a life choice that deserved respect even if they disagreed with it. These responses confirmed what I had gradually come to understand about my parents' version of love. Their affection had always been conditional on my compliance with their expectations, and they were unable to separate their disappointment in my choices from their feelings about me as a person. They loved the idea of me that they had constructed rather than accepting and supporting the person I actually was, and when those two versions came into conflict, they chose their fantasy over reality. As James and I finalized our wedding plans for a small ceremony in June, I felt sadness about my parents' absence, but no regret about the choices that had led to this point. I had discovered what unconditional love looked like through my relationship with James, and I couldn't return to the performance-based affection that had characterized my family relationships. The price of their approval was the surrender of my authentic self, and that was a cost I was no longer willing to pay. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the outdoor ceremony we had planned in the gardens of the historic mansion where James's company had recently completed a restoration project. The venue was beautiful without being ostentatious, and the guest list included people who had supported our relationship from the beginning, colleagues from both our workplaces, friends James had introduced me to from his diverse social network, Mrs. Murphy and her family from the cafe where we had met, and James's relatives who had welcomed me with warmth that contrasted sharply with my own family's rejection. As I prepared for the ceremony in a simple but elegant dress that I had chosen based on my own taste rather than anyone else's expectations, I felt a profound sense of peace about the life James and I were beginning together. We had built our relationship on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than social advantage or family pressure, and I was confident that these foundations would sustain us through whatever challenges lay ahead. The ceremony itself was everything I had hoped for, intimate and meaningful rather than elaborate and performative. James's vows brought tears to my eyes as he promised to support my dreams while pursuing his own, to build a partnership based on equality and mutual respect, and to love me for who I was rather than who he thought I should become. My own vows reflected the gratitude I felt for his role in helping me discover my authentic self, and the excitement I felt about creating a future together that reflected our shared values rather than inherited expectations. As we exchanged rings, in front of the people who truly cared about our happiness, I felt complete in a way I had never experienced during all the years of trying to meet my parents' standards and expectations. This was what love was supposed to feel like, supportive rather than controlling, liberating rather than constraining, based on acceptance rather than conditional approval. The reception that followed was relaxed and joyful, with food that reflected both our backgrounds and music that encouraged actual celebration rather than polite social interaction. James's grandmother, who had flown in from Mexico for the wedding, taught several guests traditional dances while sharing stories about James's childhood that revealed the family warmth and genuine affection that had shaped his character. The contrast with Thornfield family gatherings, where conversation was carefully managed and emotional expression was discouraged, could not have been more stark. As the evening concluded and James and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon, a modest but perfect week in a cabin near the mountains where we could hike and relax together, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in less than a year. I had lost my family's approval and financial support, but I had gained something far more valuable: the freedom to live according to my own values and the partnership of someone who loved me unconditionally. The person I had become through my relationship with James felt more authentic and more capable than the version of myself I had been while trying to meet my parents' expectations. I was more confident in my own judgment, more willing to take risks for things I believed in, and more connected to communities and causes that gave my life meaning beyond social status or financial accumulation. As we drove away from our wedding reception toward the beginning of our married life together, I knew that my parents might never understand or accept the choices I had made. Their loss felt significant but not devastating, because I had discovered that conditional love was not actually love at all. Real love, the kind I had found with James, enhanced rather than diminished the people involved, encouraging growth and authenticity rather than conformity and performance. Little did I know that within a few months, my parents would discover something about James that would completely transform their attitude toward our marriage and reveal the shallow foundations of all their previous objections to our relationship. But that revelation still lay ahead of us as James and I began our honeymoon, focused entirely on the future we were building together based on genuine partnership and mutual respect rather than social strategy or family expectation. 3 months into our marriage, I was folding laundry in our small apartment when James received a phone call that would change everything. I could hear only his side of the conversation, but his tone shifted from casual to serious within the first few seconds, and he moved to the kitchen where he thought I couldn't overhear him speaking in rapid Spanish to someone who was clearly agitated. When he returned to the living room 20 minutes later, his expression was troubled in a way I had never seen before. He sat heavily on our couch, running his hands through his hair with the gesture I had learned indicated he was processing something significant. The phone call had been from his business manager in Mexico City, someone I had heard him mention, but never met. And apparently there was a situation requiring his immediate attention. "I have to travel to Mexico unexpectedly," he said, his voice careful in a way that made me immediately suspicious. "There's a family matter that requires my presence, something that can't be handled remotely. I'll probably be gone for about a week, maybe longer, depending on how complicated things get." The vagueness of his explanation was completely unlike James, who typically shared details about his work projects and family communications with enthusiasm. When I pressed him for specifics about what kind of family matter required such urgent attention, his answers became even more evasive. He mentioned his grandmother needing help with some paperwork, a cousin having legal troubles that required family support, and business obligations that couldn't be postponed. None of these explanations seemed sufficient to account for the tension in his voice or the way he avoided making direct eye contact while he spoke. That evening, as James packed for his unexpected trip, I noticed details that didn't align with his usual travel preparations. Instead of the casual clothes and work boots he typically brought for visits with his family, he was packing dress shirts, expensive-looking ties, and leather shoes I had never seen him wear. When I commented on the formal wardrobe, he explained that some of the meetings he would be attending required business attire, but his tone suggested there was more to the story than he was sharing. The most puzzling element was a leather briefcase that appeared from the back of our bedroom closet, clearly expensive and barely used. James handled it with familiarity, checking that various documents were properly organized in compartments designed for important papers. When I asked about the contents, he mentioned contracts and financial documents related to his construction business, but the briefcase seemed far too sophisticated for the modest company he had described to me. James left for the airport early the following morning, and I found myself alone in our apartment with questions that multiplied rather than diminished as I reflected on the previous day's events. His explanation for the trip had been so uncharacteristic of his usual transparency that I began to wonder what other aspects of his background he might have simplified or omitted during our relationship. I had always accepted his description of his construction business as a small operation focused on historic preservation, but I realized I had never visited his office or met most of his employees. When I asked about his work, he typically described specific projects and technical challenges rather than business operations or financial details. I had assumed this was because he found those aspects less interesting to discuss, but now I wondered if there were other reasons for his reticence. The day after James's departure, I decided to drive by the address he had given me for his company's office, located in an industrial district I had never visited before. What I found was a modest storefront with Rivera Construction painted on the window, but the space appeared to be empty except for a reception desk and some filing cabinets. When I called the phone number listed on the door, it went directly to voicemail with a generic message that provided no additional information about the business operations. This discovery was troubling, but not necessarily indicative of deception. Many small construction companies operated primarily from job sites rather than maintaining elaborate office spaces, and James had always described his business as lean and focused on quality rather than overhead expenses. However, the disconnect between what I had expected to find and the reality of the sparse office space added to my growing sense that there were aspects of James's professional life that I didn't fully understand. Over the following days, I found myself paying attention to details I had previously overlooked or dismissed. James's truck which I had always assumed was a practical choice for construction work, was actually a high-end model with custom features. That seemed expensive for someone running a small business. His tools, which I had seen briefly when he brought them home for maintenance, appeared to be professional-grade equipment that would represent a significant investment. His knowledge of architecture and construction techniques was more sophisticated than I would have expected from someone with his described background and experience. Most puzzling was his familiarity with business practices and financial concepts that seemed advanced for someone who claimed to focus primarily on hands-on construction work. During casual conversations about my job at the Literacy Foundation, he had offered insights about nonprofit management, funding strategies, and organizational development that suggested experience with complex business operations. When I had mentioned challenges with grant applications or donor relations, his suggestions had been surprisingly sophisticated and effective. By the end of the week, James's absence had given me time to recognize a pattern of inconsistencies that I had been unconsciously ignoring or rationalizing. His explanations for various aspects of his background were plausible individually, but became questionable when considered collectively. The modest lifestyle he maintained seemed like a deliberate choice rather than a financial necessity, and his knowledge and capabilities extended far beyond what his described experience would logically provide. When James called to tell me his trip was being extended for several more days, I decided to conduct some research of my own. Using the business databases available through the Literacy Foundation's connections with local economic development organizations, I searched for information about Rivera Construction and any related business entities. What I discovered was both confusing and enlightening. Rivera Construction was indeed a legitimate business registered in our state, but it was listed as a subsidiary of a larger company called Rivera Development Group, which was itself connected to an extensive network of construction, real estate, and investment entities. The corporate structure was complex, with multiple layers of ownership and partnerships that extended across several states and into Mexico. The financial information available through public records suggested that this was not a small local business, but rather a significant regional operation with substantial assets and ongoing projects. The most surprising discovery was a news article from a business journal published 6 months earlier, featuring Rivera Development Group as one of the fastest-growing Hispanic-owned construction companies in the Southwest. The article included a photograph of the company's founder and CEO, and although the image was small and the angle was not ideal, the man pictured looked remarkably similar to my husband. According to the article, Rivera Development Group had been founded 8 years earlier by an entrepreneur who had started with historic preservation projects and had expanded into commercial development, sustainable housing initiatives, and infrastructure projects for municipal clients. The company employed over 200 people across multiple offices and had recently secured contracts for several major projects, including the renovation of government buildings and the construction of affordable housing developments. The financial figures mentioned in the article were staggering compared to what I had assumed about James's business. Rivera Development Group had annual revenues in the tens of millions, owned significant real estate holdings, and maintained partnerships with major financial institutions for project funding. The CEO was described as a visionary leader who combined technical expertise with business acumen and had become a prominent advocate for sustainable construction practices and workforce development in immigrant communities. As I read and reread the article, trying to reconcile this information with what I knew about my husband, I realized that James had been extraordinarily careful about how he described his work to me. He had never actually lied about his involvement in construction or his focus on historic preservation, but he had allowed me to assume that his business was much smaller and less successful than it actually was. The question was why he had chosen to maintain this deception and what other aspects of his background he might have similarly obscured. The implications of this discovery were overwhelming. If James was indeed the CEO of a major construction company, then his financial situation was completely different from what I had believed. Our modest lifestyle, which I had assumed reflected his limited income, was apparently a choice rather than a necessity. The concerns my parents had expressed about his ability to provide financial security were not just unfounded, but almost comically misguided. More troubling was the question of why James had chosen to present himself as a simple construction worker rather than revealing his actual professional success. Had he been testing whether I could love him without the influence of wealth and status? Had he been protecting himself from people who might be interested in his money rather than his character? Or had he been conducting some kind of elaborate experiment to see how I would respond to dating someone my parents would consider beneath my social class? The possibility that our entire relationship had been based on a fundamental deception was devastating. I had fallen in love with James believing that he was someone who worked with his hands for modest compensation, who had built a small business based on craftsmanship and integrity, who represented an authentic alternative to the privilege and pretension of my family's social circle. If he was actually a wealthy business owner who had been performing a role, then everything I understood about our connection was potentially false. When James finally returned from Mexico 10 days after his departure, I was waiting in our apartment with printouts of the articles I had discovered and a list of questions that had been accumulating during his absence. He walked through the door looking tired but relaxed, clearly not expecting the confrontation that was about to unfold. "Welcome home," I said, trying to keep my voice calm as he set down his luggage and moved to embrace me. "Before we catch up on your trip, I think, we need to discuss some things I discovered while you were gone." I held up the Business Journal article with his photograph clearly visible. "Would you like to explain why you never mentioned that you're the CEO of Rivera Development Group?" The expression that crossed James's face was a mixture of resignation, relief, and apprehension. He sat down slowly on our couch, looking at the papers I had spread across the coffee table, and nodded as if he had been expecting this conversation for months. "I was wondering when you would find out," he said quietly. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you the truth without making it seem like I've been lying to you deliberately." "But you have been lying to me deliberately," I replied, surprised by the anger in my own voice. "For over a year, you've let me believe that you run a small construction business when you're actually the head of a major company. You've watched me worry about our financial future while you apparently have millions of dollars in assets. You've allowed my parents to dismiss you as someone who couldn't provide for me when you're probably wealthier than they are." James ran, his hands through his hair, the gesture I had learned to recognize as his response to stress. "You're right that I haven't been completely honest about my business, but I need you to understand why I made that choice. When I met you, you were this incredible woman who seemed genuinely interested in who I was as a person, not what I could offer you financially or socially. I had been in relationships before where women lost interest in me and became interested in my money the moment they learned about my business success." He leaned forward, his expression earnest as he tried to explain his reasoning. "When we collided at Murphy's, you saw me as just a guy in work clothes who was covered in coffee. You talked to me like I was worth knowing regardless of what I did for a living or how much money I made. That was such a rare and precious experience that I wanted to protect it for as long as possible. I understand the appeal of being valued for your character rather than your wealth," I said, trying to process his explanation while managing my own emotional response. "But our entire relationship has been built on me believing that you represented an alternative to the money-focused world I grew up in. How am I supposed to trust anything you've told me when you've been maintaining such a fundamental deception?" James was quiet for several minutes, apparently recognizing that any explanation he offered would sound self-serving, given the circumstances. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "You're right that I should have told you the truth much earlier. I kept thinking there would be a perfect moment to explain everything, but the longer I waited, the more complicated it became. By the time we were serious enough for it to matter, I was terrified that you would think I had been playing some kind of game with your feelings." The conversation that followed lasted for hours as James explained the full scope of his business operations, and the reasons he had chosen to maintain his deception. Rivera Development Group had indeed grown from a small historic preservation company into a major construction and development enterprise. But James had continued to work on hands-on projects because he genuinely enjoyed the craft aspects of construction and wanted to stay connected to the practical realities of his industry. His decision to present himself as a simple construction worker had been motivated partly by past experiences with people who had changed their behavior dramatically once they learned about his wealth, and partly by a desire to find someone who would value him for his character rather than his financial resources. He had been hurt by relationships where women had seemed more interested in his ability to provide luxury experiences than in building genuine emotional connections. The trip to Mexico, he explained, had been necessitated by a crisis involving one of his company's major projects, a sustainable housing development that was being challenged by local political interests who had connections to competing construction firms. His presence had been required to negotiate with government officials and community leaders, a process that had taken longer than expected due to the complexity of the regulatory and political issues involved. As James described the details of his business operations, I began to understand the scale of what he had been managing while maintaining the pretense of running a small local company. Rivera Development Group employed over 300 people across offices in 5 states, maintained ongoing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and was involved in projects ranging from historic preservation to cutting-edge sustainable construction initiatives. The company's success had made James wealthy by any reasonable standard, but he had chosen to live modestly, partly to avoid the lifestyle inflation that often accompanied business success, and partly to maintain connections with the communities and workers who were the foundation of his company's culture. The apartment we shared, the truck he drove, and the simple restaurants we frequented were all reflections of his personal preferences rather than financial limitations. More importantly, James's passion for construction work and his commitment to ethical business practices were completely genuine, regardless of the scale of his operations. He had built Rivera Development Group according to principles that prioritized worker safety, environmental sustainability, and community benefit over maximum profit extraction. His enthusiasm for historic preservation and his knowledge of construction techniques were based on real expertise and authentic interest rather than performance for my benefit. As I listened to James's explanations and asked questions about aspects of his business that I wanted to understand better, I realized that my feelings about his deception were complicated. I was angry that he had allowed me to make decisions based on incomplete information, particularly the decision to defy my parents and accept financial hardship for our relationship. I was hurt that he hadn't trusted me enough to be honest about his background from the beginning. At the same time, I recognized that his concerns about being valued for his money rather than his character were legitimate. I had seen how differently people treated my family once they learned about the Thornfield wealth, and I understood why someone who had worked hard to build success would want to be certain that personal relationships were based on genuine affection rather than financial interest. What troubled me most was the question of how this revelation should affect my relationship with my parents. They had rejected James and disowned me based on their assumption that he was a poor construction worker who couldn't provide the kind of life they thought I deserved. If they learned that he was actually wealthier than our family, would they suddenly decide that our marriage was acceptable? The possibility that their objections had been based entirely on money rather than any genuine concern for my happiness was deeply disturbing. Over the following days, as James and I worked through the emotional implications of his revelation, I struggled with whether and how to inform my parents about his true financial status. Part of me wanted to confront them with evidence of their shallow materialism, to force them to acknowledge that their objections to our marriage had been based on superficial assumptions rather than meaningful concerns about compatibility or character. Another part of me recognized that revealing James's wealth would likely result in immediate attempts at reconciliation from my parents, but not because they had gained genuine appreciation for his qualities or respect for my judgment. They would want to re-establish their relationship with me because they had discovered that my husband could enhance rather than diminish their social status, which would prove that their love remained conditional on external validation rather than authentic. Concern for my well-being. James, for his part, was surprisingly indifferent to my parents' opinion of him or their potential reaction to learning about his business success. He had built his life around people who valued his character and capabilities rather than his financial resources, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by my family's focus on wealth as a measure of personal worth. He was willing to meet with my parents if I thought it would be helpful, but he had no interest in using his money to purchase their approval. The decision about how to proceed was ultimately mine to make, and it required me to consider what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with my parents going forward. If I revealed James's true financial status and they welcomed us back into the family, would that reconciliation be based on anything meaningful, or would it simply prove that their values were as shallow as I had begun to suspect? 3 weeks after James's return from Mexico, my mother called my office for the first time since our wedding. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath her usual polite demeanor. "Catherine, I hope you're well," she began as if she hadn't disowned me 6 months earlier. "I wanted to let you know that your father and I have been thinking about you and hoping that perhaps we might find a way to repair our relationship." The conversation that followed was surreal in its careful avoidance of any acknowledgement of the pain her rejection had caused or any admission that her objections to James might have been unfair. Instead, she spoke vaguely about family being important and suggested that perhaps we could find some common ground if James and I would be willing to have dinner with them at a neutral location. I agreed to consider the invitation, partly out of curiosity about what had motivated this unexpected overture, and partly because I thought it might provide an opportunity to address the fundamental issues that had caused our estrangement in the first place. When I discussed the invitation with James, he was skeptical about my parents' motivations, but willing to participate if I thought it might be helpful for my emotional well-being. We arranged to meet at the Riverside Club, an exclusive restaurant that my parents favored for important business dinners and social occasions. The choice of venue was clearly intended to provide a setting where they would feel comfortable and confident, surrounded by the kind of elegant atmosphere that reinforced their sense of social superiority. I suspected they also hoped that the formal environment might intimidate James or make him feel out of place. When we arrived at the restaurant, my parents were already seated at a corner table that provided privacy for what they clearly expected to be a delicate conversation. My mother had dressed for the occasion in one of her most expensive outfits, complete with the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother and the diamond tennis bracelet that was her signature piece of jewelry. My father wore his best suit, and the gold watch that had been a gift from his most important business partner. Their body language as we approached the table revealed their continued discomfort with James's presence. They stood to greet us with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and their handshake with James was brief and formal. However, I noticed that they both seemed to be evaluating him more carefully than they had during our previous confrontations, as if they were looking for details they might have missed before. James, for his part, was perfectly polite, but clearly unimpressed by the elaborate setting or my parents' obvious attempts to establish social dominance through environmental choice and expensive displays. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit that I had never seen before, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. The dinner conversation that followed was awkward and stilted, filled with the kind of careful small talk that people use when they're trying to avoid addressing obvious tensions. My parents asked polite questions about our living situation and our work, but their inquiries felt like information gathering rather than genuine interest in our well-being. James answered their questions directly, but without elaboration, clearly, waiting to see what they actually wanted from this meeting. The turning point came when my father, perhaps emboldened by the wine he had been drinking throughout the meal, decided to address what he obviously considered the elephant in the room. "James, I hope you understand that our concerns about Catherine's future weren't personal attacks on your character. We simply wanted to ensure that she would have the kind of security and opportunities that her background and education have prepared her for. I appreciate your concern for Catherine's well-being, James replied evenly. I'm curious, though, about how you define security and opportunities. Are you referring primarily to financial resources, or do you include things like emotional support, intellectual partnership, and shared values in your assessment of what makes a relationship successful? My father seemed momentarily taken aback by the directness of the question, but he recovered quickly and launched into a speech about the practical realities of marriage and the importance of financial stability for long-term happiness. As he spoke, I could see James evaluating my father's arguments with the same analytical approach he used for complex construction problems, identifying assumptions and logical inconsistencies that undermined the overall structure. When my father finished his explanation, James nodded thoughtfully, and then responded in a way that completely changed the dynamic of the conversation. I understand your perspective, and I agree that financial security is important for a successful marriage. Perhaps it would be helpful if I shared some information about my actual financial situation so you can make a more informed assessment of Catherine's future prospects. Over the next 20 minutes, James calmly and systematically described the scope of Rivera Development Group's operations, the company's financial performance, and his personal assets in terms that made clear he was not only financially secure, but substantially wealthier than the Thornfield family. He presented this information without boasting or defensiveness, simply providing the factual details that addressed my parents' stated concerns about his ability to provide for me. The transformation in my parents' demeanor was immediate and dramatic. My mother's expression shifted from polite tolerance to shocked attention, and my father's skeptical attitude was replaced by obvious interest and what appeared to be grudging respect. They began asking detailed questions about James's business, operations, his expansion plans, and his industry connections with the kind of engagement they typically reserved for potential business partners rather than unwelcome sons-in-law. As I watched my parents' complete reversal of attitude based solely on learning about James's wealth, I felt a mixture of vindication and disgust. Their objections to our marriage had indeed been based entirely on superficial assumptions about his financial status rather than any genuine concern about compatibility or character. Now that they understood he could enhance rather than diminish their social position, they were suddenly interested in building a relationship with both of us. The most revealing moment came when my mother began discussing potential social introductions. She could arrange for James, prominent business leaders, and wealthy families who might be valuable connections for someone in his industry. She seemed completely oblivious to the irony of offering to help someone who was already more successful than most of the people in her social circle, and she appeared to have forgotten entirely that she had declared me dead to the family just months earlier. James handled their sudden enthusiasm with remarkable grace, accepting their belated approval without expressing any resentment about their previous rejection. He answered their questions about his business honestly, but without the kind of detailed elaboration that would have suggested he was seeking their validation or approval. His attitude seemed to be that their opinion of him was irrelevant to his happiness or success, regardless of whether that opinion was positive or negative. As the evening concluded with my parents issuing invitations for future dinners and social events, I realized that this reconciliation, while superficially positive, actually confirmed my worst suspicions about their values and priorities. They were welcoming James into the family not because they had gained appreciation for his character or respect for my judgment, but because they had discovered that association with him could benefit their social and business interests. The drive home from the Riverside Club was quiet, as both James and I processed what had just occurred. Finally, I broke the silence by asking him how he felt about my parents' dramatic change of attitude. He was quiet for several minutes before responding that their reaction had been exactly what he had expected, and one of the reasons he had been reluctant to reveal his financial status earlier in our relationship. People's behavior changes when they learn about money, he said simply. Your parents aren't unusual in that regard, though their reversal was more extreme than most. The question is whether you want to rebuild a relationship with them knowing that their acceptance is based on what I can offer them financially rather than who we are as people. That question haunted me over the following weeks as my parents began including us in family events and social gatherings with an enthusiasm that felt both gratifying and hollow. They introduced James to their friends and business associates with obvious pride, highlighting his success and industry expertise in ways that made clear they viewed him as an asset to the family rather than simply as my husband. The experience of being welcomed back into my family's social circle while knowing that their acceptance was conditional and superficial was profoundly unsettling. I had gained access to the financial security and social connections that my upbringing had taught me to value, but at the cost of acknowledging that my parents' love was fundamentally transactional rather than unconditional. James, meanwhile, navigated these social gatherings with polite professionalism, but without any apparent need for my family's approval or inclusion. He had built his sense of self-worth on his own accomplishments and the relationships he had developed with people who valued his character, and my parents' belated acceptance seemed to matter very little to him personally. As I watched him interact with my family's social circle, I realized that his wealth was just one aspect of a much more complex and impressive personal story. He had built his business from nothing through a combination of intelligence, hard work, and genuine commitment to ethical practices. He had used his success to create opportunities for other people, particularly in immigrant communities that were often excluded from mainstream business networks. He had maintained his connection to the practical aspects of construction work, not because he had to, but because he wanted to stay grounded in the realities of his industry. Most importantly, he had chosen to build our relationship based on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial advantage or social positioning. Even now that my parents knew about his wealth, he continued to treat me as an equal partner rather than as someone who should be grateful for his financial resources. His love remained focused on who I was as a person, rather than what I represented in terms of social connections or family background. The contrast between James's authentic character and my parents' superficial materialism became increasingly clear as we spent more time in their social circle. While they focused on appearances, status symbols, and financial achievements, James remained interested in substance, creativity, and meaningful contribution to community welfare. While they sought relationships that enhanced their social position, he maintained friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests regardless of economic status. 6 months after our reconciliation dinner at the Riverside Club, I finally understood that my parents' acceptance of James didn't represent any real change in their values or priorities. They still measured worth primarily in financial terms, and still viewed relationships as strategic alliances rather than emotional connections. The only difference was that they had learned James could enhance rather than threaten their social position, which made him acceptable according to their unchanged standards. This realization was liberating rather than disappointing because it freed me from any lingering hope that my parents might eventually learn to value substance over appearance or character over wealth. I could maintain a cordial relationship with them while understanding that their approval was ultimately meaningless because it was based on criteria that had nothing to do with genuine human worth or relationship quality. The most profound insight from this entire experience was recognizing how completely James's initial deception had been justified by my parents' reaction to learning about his true financial status. If he had revealed his wealth at the beginning of our relationship, I might never have had the opportunity to discover what unconditional love felt like, or to develop the independence and authenticity that had emerged through our conflict with my family's expectations. By presenting himself as someone my parents would reject, James had created the circumstances that allowed me to choose love over social approval and to develop a relationship based on genuine compatibility rather than external validation. His deception had been protective rather than manipulative, designed to ensure that our connection was authentic rather than influenced by financial considerations or family pressure. As I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point, I realized that my parents' rejection and subsequent acceptance had taught me valuable lessons about the difference between conditional and unconditional love, between authentic and superficial relationships, and between substance and appearance as measures of human worth. These lessons would serve me well as James and I continued building our life together based on shared values rather than inherited expectations. 2 years later, I stood in the boardroom of Rivera Development Group's headquarters, watching James present our company's latest community development initiative to a group of investors and municipal officials. The confidence with which he commanded the room, explaining complex financial projections and sustainable construction methodologies, no longer surprised me. What continued to amaze me was how he had seamlessly integrated his business success with his commitment to meaningful social impact. The project under discussion was ambitious even by Rivera Development Group's standards. A mixed-use development that would provide affordable housing, small business incubator space, and community resources in a neighborhood that had been struggling with economic disinvestment for decades. James had spent months working with local residents to ensure that the development would serve their actual needs rather than displacing them through gentrification. And the presentation reflected this collaborative approach. As I listened to James field questions from investors who were clearly impressed by both the project's financial viability and its community benefits, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of success and leadership had evolved since our wedding day. The man I had married believing he was a simple construction worker had revealed himself to be not just wealthy, but genuinely visionary in his approach to business and community development. My own role had evolved as well. After completing a master's degree in nonprofit management with James's encouragement and financial support, I had joined Rivera Development Group as Director of Community Partnerships, a position that allowed me to bridge my background in social services with James's construction and development expertise. Together, we had created programs that provided job training for residents of the communities where we built, ensured that local businesses benefited from our projects, and established ongoing relationships with schools and community organizations. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that my previous job at the Literacy Foundation, while valuable, had never been. With Rivera Development Group's resources and James's commitment to ethical business practices, we could implement solutions on a scale that created lasting change rather than simply providing temporary assistance. My parents' friends, who had initially been skeptical about my career transition, now regularly sought our advice about their own philanthropic initiatives. Speaking of my parents, their relationship with James and me had stabilized into something cordial but essentially superficial. They included us in family gatherings and social events, introduced James to their business contacts with obvious pride, and spoke approvingly about our work to their friends. However, their acceptance remained fundamentally based on external validation, rather than genuine understanding or respect for our values. The most telling example had occurred 6 months earlier, when my mother had suggested that James should consider running for political office, arguing that his business success and community involvement would make him an attractive candidate for mayor or city council. When James politely declined, explaining that he preferred to focus on direct action rather than political positioning, my mother seemed genuinely confused by his lack of interest in the social status that political office would provide. This interaction had crystallized something I had been gradually understanding about my parents and their social circle. They measured worth exclusively in terms of public recognition and comparative advantage, and they couldn't comprehend why someone would choose substance over status when both options were available. James's commitment to meaningful work over maximum visibility was incomprehensible to them, just as their focus on appearance over impact was increasingly foreign to me. The contrast became even more apparent during family holidays, when my parents' conversations invariably centered on social positioning, financial achievements, and competitive displays of cultural sophistication. James participated politely but without enthusiasm, clearly more interested in my young cousin's school projects than in my father's latest investment strategies or my mother's elaborate charity event planning. What struck me most powerfully, during these gatherings was how limited my parents' definition of success had always been. Despite their wealth and social connections, they seemed to derive little genuine satisfaction from their accomplishments. Their relationships were transactional, their interests were performance-based, and their happiness depended entirely on external validation rather than internal fulfillment. James, by contrast, had built his life around authentic relationships, meaningful work, and genuine contribution to community welfare. His wealth was a byproduct of his success rather than its primary goal, and he used his resources to create opportunities for other people rather than simply accumulating advantages for himself. His confidence came from knowing that his work had positive impact rather than from social recognition or comparative superiority. The most profound example of this difference had occurred during a family dinner, when my father had casually mentioned his disappointment that none of his business associates had been selected for a prestigious industry award that he had been hoping to receive himself. The conversation that followed revealed how much of his self-worth depended on external recognition and how bitter he remained about perceived slights or insufficient acknowledgement of his achievements. James, who had recently been honored by the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for his contributions to sustainable development and workforce training, had never even mentioned the award to my family. When I brought it up later, he seemed genuinely surprised that anyone would consider it particularly significant. He appreciated the recognition, but it didn't define his sense of accomplishment or validate his approach to business. His satisfaction came from seeing the positive impact of his projects rather than from receiving public acknowledgement of his success. This fundamental difference in values had gradually shifted my own priorities and expectations. I no longer felt any need to prove myself according to my parents' standards or to seek their approval for my life choices. Their acceptance, while pleasant, was ultimately irrelevant to my happiness because it was based on criteria that I no longer considered meaningful measures of worth or success. The freedom that came from this realization was extraordinary. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based entirely on my own values and interests, rather than trying to meet external expectations or avoid disapproval. I chose projects that excited me rather than ones that would impress others. I built friendships based on genuine compatibility rather than social advantage. I defined success in terms of impact and fulfillment rather than recognition and accumulation. James had been instrumental in this transformation, not through direct instruction but through consistent example. His approach to life demonstrated that it was possible to achieve significant success while maintaining authentic relationships and genuine values. He had shown me what unconditional love looked like, what meaningful work felt like, and how to build a life based on substance rather than appearance. As the presentation concluded and the investors committed to funding our community development project, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial achievement or social recognition. This project would provide homes for families who needed them, create jobs for people who wanted to work, and strengthen a community that had been struggling with economic challenges for too long. The impact would be measurable and lasting, regardless of whether anyone outside our immediate community ever knew about our contribution. Walking out of the conference room with James, I reflected on how completely my definition of a successful life had changed since that morning when we had collided at Murphy's Corner Cafe. I had thought I was looking for someone different from the men in my parents' social circle, but I had never imagined finding someone who would challenge me to become different myself. The woman who had married James believing he was a poor construction worker had been seeking rebellion against her family's values, but had still been operating within their framework of assumptions about class, worth, and social positioning. The woman I had become through our relationship had transcended that framework entirely, building a life based on authentic values rather than inherited expectations. My parents' initial rejection and subsequent acceptance had both been based on the same shallow materialism, and both had been equally irrelevant to the actual quality of my relationship with James or the meaningfulness of the life we were building together. Their approval or disapproval reflected their limitations rather than our worth, and recognizing this distinction had been the key to genuine independence and authentic happiness. As James and I drove home through neighborhoods where our company's projects were providing opportunities for families to build better lives, I realized that the collision at Murphy's Corner Cafe had been the beginning of a journey toward becoming the person I was meant to be rather than the person others expected me to become. James had loved me enough to challenge my assumptions, support my growth, and demonstrate through his own example what authentic success looked like. The emerald engagement ring he had designed for me caught the afternoon light streaming through the car window, and I smiled, remembering my parents' horror when they had first seen its simple elegance. They had probably expected something larger and more ostentatious, a ring that would announce my husband's wealth and status to anyone who saw it. Instead, James had created something beautiful and meaningful that reflected our shared values, rather than his financial capabilities. That ring, like everything else about our relationship, was based on substance rather than appearance, authenticity rather than performance, love rather than strategy. My parents had finally accepted James when they learned about his money, but they had never understood that his wealth was the least interesting thing about him. His compassion, his integrity, his vision, and his commitment to building something meaningful were the qualities that had won my heart and continued to inspire my respect. As we pulled into the driveway of the home we had bought together in a diverse neighborhood where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. My parents' rejection had been painful but ultimately liberating, forcing me to choose between their approval and my authentic happiness. Their acceptance had been shallow but informative, revealing the conditional nature of their love and the superficial foundation of their values. Both experiences had taught me invaluable lessons about the difference between love that enhances and love that constrains, between success that fulfills and success that merely impresses, between relationships that support growth and relationships that demand conformity. These lessons had shaped not just my marriage to James, but my entire approach to building a meaningful life. That evening, as James and I prepared dinner together in our kitchen while discussing plans for our next community project, I realized that this was what happiness actually looked like: shared purpose, mutual respect, authentic connection, and the freedom to build something meaningful together without regard for external validation or social positioning. My parents would never fully understand the life James and I had chosen, but their comprehension was no longer necessary for my contentment. I had found love that was based on who I actually was rather than what I represented, success that was measured by impact rather than accumulation, and happiness that came from internal fulfillment rather than external approval. The woman who had been kicked out for dating below her class had discovered that authentic worth had nothing to do with social positioning and everything to do with character, compassion, and commitment to something larger than personal advantage. That discovery had transformed not just my relationship with James, but my understanding of what it meant to live a truly successful and meaningful life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.